Hello, my name is Sarah Ewan, and I'm a therapist who deals exclusively with PTSD type symptoms. I'm the owner of the Beat Retreat, which is aimed at helping anybody who's suffering any sort of unexplained PTSD symptoms to eliminate those symptoms as quickly as possible. I do believe there is a cure for PTSD, and I do believe that hypnotherapy is the route to eliminate those symptoms, just as it has done so many times before the soldiers in World War II, soldiers in the Vietnam War, and soldiers in World War I. There's a long, long list of studies that have been done to show how helpful hypnotherapy can be. So I wanted to just take this opportunity just to say a few words about PTSD and to maybe throw a little bit of light on why people feel the way they do and how difficult it can be to get rid of by yourself. And the first thing that I wanted to say is a lot of people bandy around the world's PTSD and mental health, making it clear that they're interchangeable, that if you have PTSD, it's a life sentence and it shows poor mental health. I actually don't believe that. I believe that PTSD is physics. I believe that if you have something that is put under continual stress and suffers continual emotional trauma, you will develop PTSD. And there's a reason I believe this, and there's a lot of backup information that shows this to be true. But the first thing I'd like to say is, if you suffer from any sort of PTSD symptoms, or anyone you love does, I wonder if you can imagine that that person is like a walnut. So imagine that you're holding a walnut in your hand, and the shell of the walnut is tough as old boots, isn't it? I mean, if you banged it against your knee or against your arm, you wouldn't break that shell. You'd have to bring it into contact with something really quite strong, concrete, or a wall, a table, or a hammer to break a walnut. But inside that walnut is something that's quite soft, quite malleable, so you can eat it. But the outside of that walnut is a tough, protective shell. And I wonder if you can imagine that people who have PTSD are very similar to that walnut. Over the years, they've developed a very tough, protective shell around what maybe even they can feel inside is not so tough and probably a little bit more vulnerable. But they've put that tough shell in place because so much has happened to them over their lives that it has caused them to need to be as tough and as strong as they can possibly be. And as long as they can keep that shell in place, they're okay. They might be suffering symptoms, might be battling symptoms, pushing things down, pushing things inside the walnut. But generally, while the shell is there, they're protected. I wonder if you can imagine if you took that shell and placed on top of it a paving slab. Just start with one paving slab on top of it. And imagine that paving slab is something really sad or upsetting or angering that they've experienced in their life. And probably that first paving slab is not going to break the walnut. And it's a tough little nut. You put the paving slab on top of it and just lay there. But then imagine that something else happens in life. And so you put another paving slab on top of the walnut. And it gets heavier. Shell's probably still standing up. And we don't know how many paving slabs it's going to take put on top of that walnut to crack it. But what we do know is it will. When you've layered enough paving slabs of emotional trauma on top of that nut, the shell will give way. And when the shell gives way, then everything inside is going to feel crushed. And to me, that's PTSD. You can be as hard and as tough and as strong and as resilient as you wish to be for as long as possible. But at some point, that extra paving slab will crack that shell. And you will end up in a situation where those symptoms are spilling over, emotions spilling out, and you feel like everything's out of control. And that's physics. You can't go on taking more and more and more on you and not feel the ramifications of that. And it's a strange dichotomy, really, that of course we expect that the people who've never really experienced any hardship and have had a really lovely life and have not come up against anything particularly emotionally traumatic, we think that if they were to experience something nasty, they would be the first people to crack because they've never had any experience of adversity. But that's not the case. The people who are going to crack are the ones who literally can't carry a load any further, any longer. And I think especially when you're talking about military people, first responders, healthcare workers, journalists, civilians who've been through very traumatic experiences in their life, they are going to get to a point where it's just too much for too long. And those symptoms are going to come spilling out. And I know that there is no clear definition of PTSD. It's like a pick and mix box of symptoms that you might have. And those symptoms quite often correlate quite clearly to the fight, flight, and freeze reactions that perhaps you might have experienced to different traumas in your life. And the first time that you ever met a trauma, the first time that you ever kind of went and felt that energy wave coming at you, that is often the time that the body will program its autonomic reaction. So after that, any trauma that you meet, any upset, anything sad, your body will react in the same way to the way it reacted the first time, which is why we get this gamut of PTSD symptoms. And these symptoms are not just psychological, they can become physical. Quite often the body can convert anxiety and depression, insomnia, which no one likes to experience, into a physical pain or a paralysis or a seizure. The guys coming back from the World War II were coming back with temporary blindness, temporary deafness, muteness, catatonia, simply because they had endured so much while they were at war that their body just cracked. And there is a wonderful World War II military hypnotherapist who's a psychiatrist using hypnotherapy. And his name is Jack Watkins, and he was charged with treating the worst of the cases coming back from the European front in 1943. And he claimed that there is a predisposition to PTSD. And I think we can see that quite clearly now, that predisposition is the amount of stress that somebody's carried, which then gets triggered by their life events, which then creates a neurosis. And that formula he presented to the American government during the Second World War, and 1 million men in America were ruled out of the draft because he said that they had an increased risk of developing PTSD if they were sent into battle. So he was that persuasive with the American government to make it very clear that there is a predisposition to PTSD. And that predisposition is how much those people have carried through life to get to this point. And so when people say, oh, I feel weak, I feel pathetic because I've got PTSD, I feel pathetic, I suffer anxiety, I don't know why I have panic attacks, I don't know this. These are not things that these people are making happen. They're not things that PTSD sufferers want to happen or could even make happen if they tried. These are autonomic body reactions that are creating specific symptoms in that person and then can be converted into specific physical symptoms. And the way that we can show this, illustrate this, is through something that's child's play. So I'm going to show you now, if you let me, that this is my example of PTSD. Okay, 5 little Russian dolls, we call him Frank. This Frank has got 5 parts in him. Okay, and this is how somebody develops PTSD. So let me just, for the start, let me just take 3-year-old Frank. So this is the smallest of the dolls. And I wonder if you could just imagine that this 3-year-old, perhaps, maybe he lived in a very sad, angry, aggressive home. Maybe his father used to come home and get angry with his mother and maybe even get angry or beat small Frank. Nothing was safe. Everything was upsetting. Everything was difficult. And this little boy worked out a way to cope. He just made himself as tough on the outside as that walnut. And then he internalized all his anxiety, all his upset, all his pain into his little body. And by doing that, he was able to carry on, go to nursery school, to manage at home, to hide when things got really difficult. But there's no doubting that he suffered serious trauma in his life, in a time when he had no resources. He couldn't run away, he had nowhere to run to. He had nobody to look after him except these two parents who were at war, and he got caught in the crossfire quite often. And all the emotion that this little boy suffered, this 3-year-old Frank, would be inside that tiny little wooden figure. Yeah. So then let's jump forward to 6-year-old Frank. And let's just take a moment and put 3-year-old Frank inside 6-year-old Frank. Okay, so you've now got a 6-year-old that has gone through 6 years of living with an abusive parent and watching his mum get upset or hurt and internalizing all this emotion, all this anxiety inside his little body. And now he's inside 6-year-old Frank, and all that emotion is now trapped inside the older boy, who perhaps he started school because he looks a bit weak and a bit pathetic because he keeps himself to himself. He's being bullied at school. So he is having to deal now with not only the fact that home is not safe, but now his school life is not safe either. And getting from home to school is not safe either because somebody might attack him on the way. And the magnitude of emotion as you go from trauma to trauma could be imagined like an earthquake. So a 5.7 earthquake is twice as large as a 5.6. So just imagine the magnitude of the doubling inside this boy of the 3-year-old's trauma and stress and upset. And then now inside a 6-year-old who's having to encounter more and more stress and upset, having to still keep that walnut shell as tight as he possibly can, as protective as he can, while internalizing all that upset and trying not to let it show. So then we can move to 10-year-old Frank. So we'll put the others inside. So all the emotion of the others goes inside 10-year-old Frank. So now you've got what is essentially a very disturbed little boy. His father's left home. Now his mother's married again. He's got a stepfather. The stepfather sees the boy as not only a bit of an inconvenience, but also a bit weak, a bit pathetic. You know, he's very anxious all the time, very nervous, pulls away from other people, doesn't want to go and play football or watch football, large crowds, he doesn't do that. And so he's very much on his own. He never really made friends at school, maybe one or two, and now he's got to go to a big school, which is even more scary. And so all that anxiety, that autonomic reaction inside him to take anxiety, take pressure, and put it inside himself so that he doesn't become a bigger target, is now inside. And you can hear again, you've got the magnitude of the 3-year-old emotion and the 6-year-old emotion. And then now you've got the 10-year-old's emotion added on top of that, just as he goes into one of the most stressful parts of life for a young child. So then we can look at 15-year-old Frank. So we can put, again, knowing that obviously the person stays inside the body as they get bigger. And so now we can look at 15-year-old Frank. So this lad obviously has entered puberty, which is easy for no one, even more difficult for him because he's so shy and so withdrawn. So he doesn't try to get a girlfriend or anything like that. Everyone thinks he's a bit weak, a bit useless, doesn't do well at school. He's satisfying all their limiting beliefs. He feels intense scrutiny all the time. And perhaps he's developed an awful blushing, so that when anyone even says hello to him, he gets this enormous blush in his face, which is incredibly obvious to everybody, and everyone takes even more mickey out of him. At home, still the same. He's a bump on the outside of the wheel in his house. And so he really is incredibly sad, incredibly upset. Very little in his life is satisfying. But he's trying, and he's still got that tough outer shell, and he's doing everything he can to go forward in life. But nothing is as he would want. And he can just feel so sad. So then we move to adult Frank. Okay, so adult Frank, he's got bigger, put them inside each other. He's got bigger, he can cope more. No one can beat him up on the way to school. No one's going to steal his bike. He's a bigger kid, but he still feels that enormous anxiety inside his body. And every time he goes to do something like a new job or a promotion, he has to go into a situation where he doesn't know people, he feels this enormous wave of fear. And he has no idea why. Because even though you can hear that 3-year-old, 6-year-old, 10-year-old are inside, he doesn't remember that time. He doesn't remember being that age. He doesn't really remember what it was like to live with his dad. He hasn't seen his dad for years. But all he knows is that when he's put in a situation that is worrying, he feels an immense crippling fear. And he's worried that it's going to absolutely ruin his career, trash his chances of a family, and therefore make life difficult. And the most important thing about what he feels, about this emotion that he feels, is it's irrational. There's no reason for it. It's not that scary to go for a promotion board, you know, he's well prepared. But he feels this crippling, irrational, illogical emotion. And the reason is that all the parts that are inside of him that have gathered all that negative energy, that have gathered all that emotion, shoved all that emotion down inside of him, have the ability to take executive control of adult Frank. So if adult Frank gets particularly sad, particularly upset, particularly withdrawn, any one of that 3-year-old, 6-year-old, 10-year-old, 15-year-old can rise up inside of Frank and take executive control for a few minutes or a day or even for a week and absolutely cripple him with the emotion that they're feeling. And the dichotomy is that those parts want him to focus on why they're so upset. That's why they're sending all that emotion up to him. It's like a flag, like a clue, saying, look, this is what happened when I was 3. But of course, when we're adults, we don't want to go back to what happened when we were younger. We don't want to really think about it. You know, we can kind of half remember that life wasn't that fun, but we certainly don't want to go back to anything that's upsetting. So we kind of move away from that feeling. We try and squash it down, try and distract ourselves with something else. But the more we try to distract ourselves from those feelings, the more the Franks inside are screaming, the more symptoms they're pushing up inside Frank's body to try and get his attention. And they want him to understand the repressed memories. They want him to know exactly what happened because they're living with this emotion that's now, because Frank is now sealed, then there's no way that emotion can get out of his body. It's like pinballing, like a loop inside his body of all this negative emotion. And the thing that hypnotherapy can do is hypnotherapy can allow you, even though Frank is stressed to the hilt, it can take Frank into such a relaxed state that he will be able to go to a frequency where he can actually hear the parts inside of him, explain what caused this autonomic reaction in him. And people say, well, you know, how can that work? You know, what is hypnotherapy? Hypnotherapy is essentially becoming very relaxed. My clients describe it as a legal high, those that shouldn't know about it. But they say it's like going down into a place where you're so relaxed you can hardly feel your arms or your legs, and you just feel your whole body dissolving, and the chatter in your mind that maybe you've been struggling against as someone PTSD just quietens, and you're just floating on this lovely bed of air. And in that state, which of course is very similar to what happens when we fall asleep. When we fall asleep, we can't feel our arms and our legs. We're not really aware of the chatter of the day. In that state, it's possible for the body to bring forward what the major issues are. What is causing this riot of emotion inside this person? And so when I do hypnotherapy, I ask people to do nothing at all. They don't talk to me. They don't explain what's going on in their own mind. That's private. I just ask them to lie down and to relax. And people will say, well, I can't relax. I haven't relaxed in years. And you say, well, I would use the cadence of my voice to make you feel relaxed. So you just listen to me. I'll just be tour guide Barbie and take you on a trip and take you down into this lovely, relaxed sensation. And then we'll see what comes to you in your dreamlike state. And so I take about 45 minutes to take the person into a totally relaxed state. And even those who say they couldn't relax, after about 3, 4, 5 minutes will say, oh, I felt my toes suddenly relax, and then I felt the rest of my body going, and I could hear you, but not really hear you. And I felt like I wanted to go to sleep, and occasionally I did fall asleep, and then I came awake and you're still prattling on. but all they knew is they didn't want to wake up. They didn't want to come back. It was just such a lovely, relaxed feeling. And it's a bit like if any of you have had an operation, when you, just as they're putting you down into the operation and they're just putting the gunge in your hand, and it just feels wonderful. And it's that state, but you don't wake up in pain, hopefully. You wake up calm and relaxed. Sorry, Frank on the floor. So it's an ability to take you to a state of relaxation where your brain goes down from what essentially might be about 50 hertz on an EEG in an active mind down to 0.5 to 4 hertz on an EEG when you're in a deep sleep. And then again, you may be aware of what I'm saying, you may not be aware of what I'm saying. And all I say to the body at that point is, could you bring forward whatever is the root cause of what's causing these feelings in Frank, whatever the 3-year-old Frank first experienced that took him into that sense of fear and anxiety and upset? And can you just show him the root cause? And often the root cause is not the worst thing that's ever happened to them in their life. Often the root cause is simply something that would have upset a 3-year-old, getting lost in a supermarket, or someone shouting at them, or mum shouting at dad and they think dad might leave, and then what's going to happen to them? And that is enough to set the seed, which will then develop into that predisposition if they then go through more and more and more traumatic situations. I'd like to end with a lovely analogy that was given to me by a US Marine who I took into this lovely relaxed state. And he said, I was like drifting, as if I was just floating. And I suddenly became aware all around me, like I was dreaming, all around me were fairy lights. And they were on a long, long, long string. And each one of these fairy lights was lit, and it was something that had happened to me that was really upsetting. And he said, I could see them all around me, all these lights, all these incidents of things that had happened to me. And I followed down the line, down through all my life, down to childhood. And I got down to a plug. And he said, and there it was laid out to me, the first time that I'd ever taken a breath in when something awful happened around me at that age. And I could see it. I could see it as if I was dreaming it. He said, and then I felt this urge to pull the plug out of the wall. And when I did, all the lights went out on all the fairy lights. And I was just standing there holding this plug, and everything had gone. And when this chap came back to consciousness, and generally I just tell them, it's been an hour and a half and time to come back, and I count from 1 to 5 and bring them back. And when they came back, then he came back, he said to me, I don't feel the same way. I don't feel any tautness. I don't feel my heart's not racing. I don't feel like I'm stressed or anxious. And so I said, well, you can just come out of hypnosis, so go home and see how it feels in a few hours. And he went home, and then he rang up and he said, it hasn't come back. I don't feel anything like I felt before. And for that man, it never came back. That was it. He had been shown what had set off the autonomic reaction, and he'd been shown all the other events, which we call secondary sensitizing events. And he'd been shown them all. And he could understand now why he reacted the way he did, even though he had no context for it, because he didn't have a memory of that first event. But now he did, and it was gone. And the body no longer needed to send him the symptoms, and no longer needed the flags and the clues waving, because he'd got that insight. And for him, it was 1 session. But for others, it's 2, sometimes 4, sometimes 6, rarely more than 6. And it's such a lovely, gentle therapy. And if you came in and sat down and never spoke to me, if you literally just said, right, go on, and then I speak, and then you leave, and you don't tell me what you see, and you don't tell me what you feel, it still works. I treat a lot of people from the SAS, and I treat people from the government services, and they don't want to talk to me. They don't want to tell me anything. And other people who've been through traumatic events, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to go through it again and again and again. So they don't have to. Their body knows what's wrong. When they walk in the door to me, their body knows what's wrong. I don't, but their body does. And over the course of this lovely, relaxing time where they come once a week, say for 6 sessions, and then in between they get given recordings so that they can seek that feeling between sessions. And at the end of those 6 weeks, they will have the insight that they need. And I have written a book of case histories of people who've used this method. And these people were all military serving or veterans, and they were all in the advanced stages, I should say, but it's not advanced stages, but advanced numbers of trauma. So what the medical profession would call CPTSD. And they were all experiencing a myriad of symptoms. And over 6 sessions, all their symptoms disappeared, all their pains disappeared. And you can read or listen to that book by going to my website, thebeatretreat.com. So all one word, thebeatretreat.com. If you go to that website, you'll see under books, a free audio book or free download of a print book. So you can read their stories. So you can see that if you're suffering from PTSD, that there is a way to tackle this. It doesn't require any medication, doesn't require endless talking or exposing of any of the things you don't want to talk about. And also on that website, there are recordings. So if you don't want to interact with a human, you can go on there and you can pick a recording that matches whatever you're feeling or however you're feeling and just listen to it. And I would advise listen to it for 21 days in a row, because the body has a system of habit that it makes an autonomic process over 21 days. So if you've already got the habit in terms of your reaction, reprogram another one using those recordings. And I do some group therapy as well, where you can come and anonymously and just listen to me burble on and then have some hypnotherapy directly from me. The recordings are just as effective and totally free. And I also have a crisis line. If you feel you need to talk to someone, if you want to discuss this a little bit further, you can call anytime, whenever you like. Use my WhatsApp number and I'll be happy to help. Because the most important thing, I believe, having done 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, having been a journalist covering enormous amounts of emotional trauma for 30 years of my career, and having just watched people struggling with something that is curable and in a short time and not with enormous effort, I just want to help. I want to help as many people as possible take care of those symptoms and eliminate those symptoms and get back to a normal, healthy life and have their family understand them. Even it works so well for children as well. So never hesitate to get in contact with me. And thank you for listening to me tonight. Good night.